FF9 Pictures presents The Sleeping Cetra Audiobook. Chapter 2, Parenthood.
5 years later. As she began baking breakfast, it was early in the morning, but she could not sleep. Her raven hair was tied back in a low ponytail, and she was dressed in a white shirt, black shorts with overalls, and boots. It had been 5 years since she and her friends took in Aerith. They found an abandoned cottage in the midst of a forest known as the Forgotten Forest. The cottage supported the living arrangements quite nicely after the three cleaned it up by hand. Yuffie complained, desperately wanting to use magic. Right now, the kitchen looked nice and well kept. Barrett found an old circular table and fixed it up so they could dine on it. Tifa and Yuffie decorated the kitchen with curtains and placed a tablecloth on the table to try and add color to the dull place. There were 3 bedrooms and 1 bathroom. Tifa and Yuffie shared the biggest room, where the 2 girls shared bunk beds. Barrett took the second room with a double bed all to himself. The last room was for Aerith. Of course, she only moved into it when she was old enough. The girls had her crib in their room so they could get to Aerith easier at night. The arrangement were not as the group would have liked it, but it had to do. So far, they were safe from Sephiroth. No doubt he was looking for Aerith, when and if he found out she was no longer in the palace. Tifa only prayed that the remainder of the 16 years would go by fast. At times, she feared Sephiroth would find them and complete the curse. She would wake up at night in a cold sweat and then check on the little princess to find her well. Tifa cracked an egg against the pan and opened it, allowing the contents to spill in the pan. She did that twice more and watched as the egg sizzled. She began to hum a tune as she took her spatula and flipped the eggs over. Unknown to her as she baked, a door to one of the bedrooms opened. Tifa continued to hum when she heard shuffling behind her. The corners of her mouth twitched to a smile as she whistled. She could hear the shuffling continue and then something be dragged across the floor. It was a chair. She continued to whistle when the chair stopped right next to her. Tifa looked down, her reddish-brown eyes watching a small 5-year-old girl climb up onto the chair.
Well, look who is up all on her own today.
Her eyes met with a pair of bright emerald green ones. The little girl looked up and smiled happily. She was dressed in an oversized nightshirt and pink slippers. Her brown locks were loose, flying everywhere.
Aunt Tifa, you know what today is, right?
The girl jumped up excitedly. Tifa flipped the eggs out of the pan and onto a plate. She then cracked 3 more and then watched them sizzle. The girl jumped up and down again, waiting for an answer. Tifa grinned her eyes, looking behind her and then back at the girl.
Is today August 11th?
Tifa asked, pretending not to know.
No.
May 2nd?
No.
Tifa flipped the eggs off the plate. She shrugged her slender shoulders and turned to the girl.
I just don't know what day could it be.
My birthday. I'm 5.
She held up her hand and Tifa pretended to look shocked. The little girl held such innocence that it was adorable. Tifa looked at the little girl, bending down to her level.
5 years old? Wow, you're a big girl now. I guess that means we'll have to throw you a party, Aerith.
Just then, the little girl was hoisted up into the air. She found herself being held by Barrett. His large hands wrapped around her small frame and threw her arms around him, giving him a hug.
Morning, Uncle Barrett.
Good morning, kiddo,
he said, holding her up. Just then, Yuffie snatched her away, hugging Aerith to her in a tight squeeze. Aerith began to struggle out of Yuffie's vice-like grip. However, the young girl began to swing Aerith around and even tossed her once in the air, catching her in her arms.
Yuffie, please. Well, look who is 5 years old today. Happy birthday.
Yuffie spun Aerith around and then planted her in a chair with a large cushion on it. Tifa then placed a plate of eggs, toast, and a large glass of juice for Aerith to eat and drink. The young girl took her fork and began eating. Barret and Yuffie each took a seat on opposite ends of the table as Tifa brought them their breakfast. They watched the young girl eat slowly, enjoying her breakfast. Just then, Tifa cleared her throat. As she sat down, she looked over at Barret, who was munching on his toast. She coughed a little louder to get his attention, but he was oblivious. Yuffie looked up and gave Barret a sharp kick under the table, finally getting his attention for Tifa. Barret growled and noticed Tifa staring at him.
What?
Tifa glared at him. The three had come up with a plan for today, and Barret already forgot. It took the man a minute to remember, but when he did, it looked as a light went on his head.
Oh.
Tifa and Yuffie shook their heads in dismay.
So Aerith, you want to go out for a walk in the forest today?
The little girl looked up, her eyes shining. She loved it when her guardians could take her outside their little cottage. She loved going into the forest and picking flowers and playing in the stream. It was usually a rare thing for her because her guardians were always so busy with chores. She would usually be in her room coloring or playing quietly. Sometimes she even was staring sadly out her window, desperate to get out.
Yes.
Okay, we'll finish eating and get dressed. You'll need your energy.
Aerith quickly finished cleaning off her plate and bounded to her room. She then ran out and looked over at her guardians.
I can't reach the drawer.
Tifa pushed her chair back and got up to help dress the little girl. In the small room where Aerith was a bed just her size. A small toy chest lay at the corner of the room next to the window. The floor was hardwood, but there was a soft pink rug for Aerith to sit on. Tifa opened a wooden dresser and found a pink dress for Aerith to wear. Aerith lifted her arms up and Tifa pulled off her nightshirt and placed on the pink dress. Next, she took out a pair of boots from a closet for Aerith to wear outside. When she finished dressing, Tifa redid her hair, tying it in a thick braid.
Now hurry, before Uncle Barret leaves.
The girl looked horrified and ran out of her room. Tifa chuckled as she watched the girl run out to the front door where Barret was waiting. Barret was dressed in a moss green coat, tan pants, and boots. Aerith grabbed onto his hand, making sure she would not be left behind.
Wait! Here, Aerith, take your umbrella. It might rain. Oh, and pick some flowers, okay?
Yuffie handed her a small pink umbrella and a basket. Aerith took them and smiled up at her aunt. She nodded and gave her an okay before taking her uncle's hand again and walking out the door. Tifa and Yuffie watched as those two walk out into the forest.
Okay, time to get ready for the party. Yuffie, you start decorating, I'll bake the cake.
Yuffie nodded and hurried to get out the decorations. Across the vast green plains, not too far from the Forgotten Forest, in the kingdom of Nibelheim, plans were being made. The Queen Strife was sitting in her throne room discussing with her advisors. The queen looked regaled in her silk yellow gown and robes. Sitting on her head was a golden crown covered in several different gems and jewels. In her hand, she held a large golden staff. Standing before her were 3 wise advisors. The first advisor was the most trusted but youngest of them, Zen. He wore a blue robe and had long black hair silked back but let loose. The second was an older man named Bugenhagen. He had no hair on his head, but was wise in the knowledge of nature and technology. The third man was Heidegger, also an old man. He had white hair and a long white beard and mustache. From the top of his forehead, going over his right eye and stopping at his cheek, was a large scar. No one knew how he got it, except himself, but no one ever bothered to ask.
The marriage proposal has gone through with King Gast. He has finalized the proposal. When his daughter returns, she will be married to one of your sons.
Very well.
Now, which one shall marry the princess of the Cetra?
No doubt Prince Zack will be the one to marry her. He is, after all, the oldest one here.
His Highness is to precede the throne of Nibelheim. Once our kingdoms join, one prince will rule our kingdom, and the other will rule the kingdom of the ancients.
The queen held up her hand to silence her advisors. She turned to a servant who was at her side, whispering an order. The servant bowed and quickly exited the throne room. Several moments later, a young boy with jet black hair appeared, guided by the servant. The queen dismissed the servants, who bowed politely and left. Once she was gone, the queen beckoned the boy forward. He was dressed in a deep blue shirt and pants. His boots were brown, and he looked as if he was been busy playing.
Zack,
Yes, Mother?
you know you are going to be a king one day.
Of course, Mother.
He looked up at her mother, and she smiled at her son.
Then tell me, would you rule Nibelheim after me? Or would you rather marry the princess of the Cetra and rule the kingdom of the ancients?
Zack looked at his mother. He was 10 years old now. He barely remembered the incident that happened in the palace when Sephiroth cursed the princess. The young boy knew he would have an arranged marriage. It was inevitable. Yet, the princess was 5 years younger than he was. He also knew he would not be able to meet her until she was 16.
No, Mother, I would rather rule Nibelheim.
The queen nodded and waved her hand, dismissing the child. Zack turned away and began to leave. He could still hear his mother and her advisors speaking.
Then it is settled. Prince Cloud will marry the princess.
Zack turned his head slightly, looking back at the agreement made. Cloud, his younger brother, was 2 years younger than him. He had no idea about arranged marriages or anything about ruling a kingdom. Zack, being the oldest, would naturally inherit the throne. However, now the possibility to having an arranged marriage with another kingdom, Cloud could now rule his own kingdom. The only problem was, Cloud could not have cared less. Zack returned outside to the Chocobo stable where Cloud was. The two brothers loved to go out riding and had their own adventures when they were not having studies and such. Zack passed by the stables where the giant golden bird stood squawking. Zack reached the farthest stall where a golden chocobo stood. In the stall with the bird was his younger brother, gently brushing his feathers. Zack smirked, getting Cloud's attention. Cloud looked similar to Zack. However, unlike his brother, he had golden blonde locks and azure eyes. The younger boy was wearing his riding cloths, purple pants, and a white shirt with riding boots. Cloud loved his chocobo because, aside from him and Zack, the bird hated everyone and anyone who came near him.
What's so funny?
I know a secret.
What is it?
Zack patted the chocobo, who gave him a small chirp. Cloud watched his older brother with annoyance, wanting to know what this was all about. Zack walked around the chocobo and smiled at his brother knowingly.
I'm gonna be king of Nibelheim.
I know, you always tell me that.
Guess what? You're going to be a king of the Cetra, and now you'll have to take lessons on how to be a king too.
I am not.
Uh-huh. Mom said so. You're going to marry the princess too.
For the longest time, he knew Zack would be king and not him. He was the youngest, and he would just live in the palace and have his own life. How could he become king? Why did he have to marry a princess? Cloud looked down at the ground. This was the last thing he wanted to happen to him. This was the worst day for an 8-year-old boy prince. Walking in the forest, Baird held Aerith's hand as they wandered through. Aerith was excitedly looking around as they walked deeper and deep. The trees were large and created canopies over them, keeping the light rain off them. As they walked, Aerith had to take several steps to keep up with her uncle's long strides. After all, she was a tiny little girl.
Uncle Barrett?
Yeah, kiddo?
How come you don't have any friends?
Baird looked down at the girl, her emerald eyes looking sadly at him. He knew the gift he had given her long ago was that she would never be lonely. Yet, now he cursed it because he had to keep her away from everyone. Baird and the others knew Sephiroth was looking for the child the moment he found out she was gone away from the castle. Yet, the only way to protect her would be to keep her away from everyone. They could not trust anyone.
You have me as a friend. You don't like me anymore?
Covering his face with hands, Aerith tugged at the older man's shirt, begging him not to cry.
I'm sorry, Uncle. Please don't cry. I didn't mean to make you sad.
Baird stopped his fake crying and looked at the little girl. He gently placed a hand on her head and then pointed to the little ways down the path. Aerith looked over and saw a patch of wildflowers growing.
I think your aunts wanted some flowers. Why not get some? Now don't wander off, okay?
Aerith nodded and ran into the path and began plucking out the best flowers. Baird sat down against a tree and watched the little girl picking flowers. He let out a yawn, wishing he had gotten more sleep. Leaning back, he closed his eyes just for a moment's rest. Just for a moment. Aerith plucked out a pink flower and smiled. She looked back at her sleeping uncle and frowned. She felt bad for upsetting him. Yet, she wished she had a kid her own age to play with. She hated being in her room playing by herself with her homemade dolls and such. She looked around the patch of flowers and noticed a little further down there were some purple wildflowers. The young girl fathered her flowers and headed for the patch just a little further down. No harm would come of it. She picked 3 or 4 of the flowers when she noticed another patch a little farther with red wildflowers. She scurried over to the patch and picked several of them when she heard water. She looked up and noticed a small river running a little ways from her. However, growing all around the bank were bright yellow and white flowers. Aerith looked at them and wondered if her uncle and aunts would like those as well. As Aerith was picking flowers, unknown to her, something was watching her. Its eyes stared at her, carefully watching the carefree girl. Aerith walked near the river, picking a yellow flower from the ground and holding it up to her nose. It smelled sweet, so she added it to her collection. As the girl took a step near the river, she felt her feet slide out from under her. The slippery grass made her fall into her back and slide right into the water. Her umbrella went flying across the ground along with the flowers and her basket. But met with water. Panicking, she began to kick and wave her hands frantically under the water as she tried to fight her way to the surface. The only problem was, she had no idea how to swim yet. Aerith felt herself unable to hold her breath much longer. She grabbed her mouth, trying to keep it closed, when she felt something clamp against her coat. Aerith felt her body being dragged up to the top. When her head broke out of the water, she gasped for the fresh air. Her savior flipped her onto its back and swam her to the shore. Once there, her savior laid her on the ground as she coughed out the water she swallowed. She felt a hand pat her back, trying to force the water out so she could breathe normally.
Ooh, are you alright, Missy?
Aerith looked up and gasped in awe as she saw what was talking to her. It was not a person, but a black and white cat, wearing a crown, a cape, boots, and gloves. He was riding on a giant white creature called a Moogle. Aerith stared, unsure what to say when she felt water splash at her. She looked over to see a large cat-like creature looking at her. It had fur like the color of fire with feathers on his head like a headdress. His tail was actually on fire. Aerith stared at the 3 creatures, still in disbelief. Maybe she is mute? Sad. Such a pretty girl cannot speak. Don't you agree, Kate Sith?
I should say so, Red 13.
The cat spoke out, jumping up and down on the Moogle.
I can talk. I was just really scared.
Nothing to be afraid of now. You're all right. Now tell me, little one, why are you out in the forest all alone? It's quite dangerous.
Oh no! My uncle must be scared because I'm gone.
Red 13 lowered himself to the ground. His fur rippled as he shook some water off of him and looked at Aerith. Come, child. We shall go find your uncle. Climb on my back. Aerith did as instructed and climbed on his back. She sat carefully so she would not hurt him and held onto his fur gently as well. When she was secure, Red 13 lifted himself up and looked at Kate Sith. They then proceeded through the forest to find Barrett. At that moment, however, Barrett awoke to see that Aerith was nowhere in sight. Barrett began to panic and was screaming out the girl's name as he rushed back and forth hoping to spot her. When he could not see her, he rushed down a path still calling out her name. In his mind, he could see Tifa killing him for losing Aerith. How could he have fallen asleep? He swore at himself for being so stupid to close his eyes just for a second.
Aerith! Aerith! Where are you?
He rushed forward when he saw the small umbrella that Aerith was given. Next to it, he saw the wild flowers and a basket thrown across. Suddenly, the worst thing came to mind. What if a wild animal came and took Aerith off? Or what if one of Sephiroth's henchmen came and took her away? Barrett grabbed the side of his head and began screaming for Aerith.
Uncle Barrett?
Barrett's eyes widened as he turned around to see Aerith. The moment he saw her, he gathered the little girl in his arms, hugging her tightly. He lifted her off the ground and began thanking anything and everything for Aerith being alive and well.
Uncle Barrett, I can't breathe.
Barrett let her go and looked down at the girl who was soaked to the skin in her dress.
What happened to you? I told you not to wander off. Are you trying to give me a heart attack?
I'm sorry. I wanted to pick flowers for you so you wouldn't be sad.
She looked back up at her uncle, about ready to cry. Barrett tried to stay mad, but seeing her emerald green eyes looked so sad, he could not. Sighing, he reached down and placed his hand on her shoulder and hugged her again.
Let's get home, kiddo.
He picked Aerith up and placed her on his shoulders. He then gave her back her umbrella, basket, and flowers. Aerith held on to her uncle and her things as he made the trek home. Aerith turned over to the bushes, however, and waved goodbye to Red 13 and Kate Sith, who were hiding there. She smiled as she saw Kate Sith's paw waving back at her. The two were rather apprehensive of meeting with humans, after a horrible experience that happened between them and Red 13. As Barrett walked off, Aerith held onto her uncle, watching the scenery. She watched the leaves rustle in the trees from the wind, and the tiny droplets on the leaves scattered around. When a large drop hit Aerith on the top of her head, she looked up, wondering if it was going to rain. It was then she noticed something far off in the distance, a large palace. She stared at it, curiosity filling her. She never had seen something like that.
Uncle Barrett!
What is it?
What's that big thing over there?
She pointed toward the palace. Barrett looked over and felt a little apprehensive on telling her. After all, that was where Aerith's real home was. In 11 more years, she would return there and become a princess, marry, and eventually rule the Cetra.
That's a castle. This is where King and Queen lives. Those very rich people are the boss of all people in the city. They're very nice though, and have fancy clothes and parties. They even have a little princess who's really cute and kind.
What's a princess?
A princess is a kind and a beautiful girl, who's the daughter of King and Queen. She's very rich, and everyone loves her too.
Does she have a lot of friends too?
Yes, she has a lot of friends, toys, chocobos, and anything she could imagine.
Wow! Uncle Barrett, can I be a princess someday?
Barrett smiled sadly. Lucky for him, Aerith could not see. She was so innocent, and yet he wished he could tell her about being a princess. No, it was for her safety not to know.
You can be whatever you want.
He noticed the sun was beginning to descend.
We better get home, birthday girl.
Aerith nodded and held onto Barrett as they walked through the forest. She smiled, thinking about being a princess, a childlike thing to think of. Just as they were approaching the cottage, Barrett took Aerith off his shoulders.
Oh, and Aerith. Let's not tell Tifa and Yuffie about you getting lost, okay?